Good morning, church. It's good to see you this morning. Glad that you're here. Hope you had a wonderful week. Tell you a story. It's not about this lady, but it's about a man and his son. It seems as if the mother and father had decided that they were going to raise their son with a lack of conflict and with a lack of discipline, too. But needless to say, one day, little boy decided what he wanted for lunch. The mother asked him, "What do you want for lunch?" And he said, "I want a worm." And she said, "Okay." And she said, "What do you want?" And he said, "I want a worm." And she said, "Honey, what do you really want?" He said, "I want a worm." And the father said, "No, you're not getting a worm." "Well, I want a worm." "No, you're not getting a worm." And finally, the mother, trying to raise this child without really any borders, said, "Go get him a worm." Father said, "I'm not getting him a worm." "Yeah, go get him a worm. It's what he wants." And so father went out and he found a worm and he brought it in. And as he brought it in for the little boy said, "I want Daddy to eat half of it." Daddy said, "I'm not eating half that worm." "I want Daddy to eat half of that worm." "I'm not eating that worm." "I want you to eat half of that worm." And the mother said, "You know what we agreed to." And so the father ate the worm, his half. Little boy started pitching a fit. What in the world is the problem now? And the little boy said, "Daddy ate my half of the worm." There are just some people you just can't, they're just frustrating. They're just aggravating. You just can't do anything to please them. You can't do anything that's right. You can't do anything for them. Now, sometimes people frustrate us not because their ideas or ideals are different than ours, and there's a lot of folks like that. But sometimes folks frustrate us because they have different ways of doing things. Or maybe they do it slower than what we want it done. Or maybe they do it faster than what we want it done. They're just polar opposites to us. And so it may not only just be opinion and worldview and things of that nature, but it also may just be just their attitude and just the way they go about doing things. But they just frustrate us. They just get it next to us. And we sometimes want to just pull our hair out and just feel miserable. And yet, the Bible teaches us about things that we need to practice with regards to our fellow man. Now, some would say, "Oh, preacher, what does that have to do with salvation?" Well, if you stop and think about, as we've defined sin before, as that which contradicts sonship with God and brotherhood with mankind, we understand that it's not just, if you will, that vertical relationship that we have with God that's important, but also the horizontal relationship that we have with people that God says is important. And so it is that we need to be mindful that the Lord says, yeah, some people are going to frustrate you. They frustrated him. There were folks in the early church that were frustrated, and we'll see a few in just a few minutes. There were folks in the Old Testament that were frustrated. We'll see that. Folks just sometimes frustrate other folks. How do you deal with them? Because, you see, we might say this. We might say, well, it just takes all kinds. I'm sort of like an elder back several years ago that I had. He said, "Preacher," he said, "it doesn't take all kinds." He said, "It really doesn't. We just have to learn how to deal with all kinds." Well, there's a sense in which I agree with him. What does the Bible say about dealing with people? The first thing it says is be patient with folks that frustrate you. Be patient. That's easier said than done, isn't it? Because literally we do sometimes. We want to pull our hair out. We want to scream. We want to shout. We want to run out. We want to do something because they've made us upset. And yet the Bible says, be patient with these people, no matter who they are. We're told that the servant of the Lord, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24, must not strive. Be gentle unto all people. Paul in Colossians chapter 3, where he talks about putting off certain things, putting off the old man, he talks about putting on the new man, and he talks about being humble of mind and meekness. But then he says in verse 13, forbearing and forgiving one another. The idea of forbearing is the idea of being patient with people, to be patient with them in what they say and do towards you, to be patient with them, to be slow to getting mad and slow to anger towards them and their opinions and their ideas and their ideals. You know, we look at the early church, and one of the things we find out is that there were people and there were groups that always didn't see eye to eye. We're studying on Sunday mornings in the auditorium class, we're studying the book of Acts, and there are two great examples of this. In Acts chapter 6, the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Jews, were upset because they felt like their widows were being neglected. Here they were, they had a group of widows that they loved, and they wanted to make sure that they were cared for, and they felt like they were neglected. And so they spoke up, and they caused a little friction, and yet it was soon resolved. And in Acts 15, you also see a problem. For there were certain of the Pharisees that came and said that except an individual be circumcised, he cannot be saved, according to verse 1 and verse 2. And so there was a meeting. The early church came together with the 12, it says, and they met to decide what they were going to do. Now, when these folks, if you will, had a little bit of a problem, had a little bit of discussion, it was not, if you will, just well, I think this, well, I think this, well, here's what I feel. These folks got upset. But they needed to learn to be patient. I think of a great example in the Old Testament. When I think about an individual with patience, I think about a man by the name of Isaac in Genesis chapter 26. Isaac was out wandering, if you will, because there was a time in which there was a drought. There was a need. And so he's going from place to place to find water, and he finds a well, one that his father had dug. And there were those that came and claimed it at Essex. And so he moves on to the next well. And guess what? They come and claim that well. He doesn't fight. He doesn't sit down and say, oh, I pitched my tent here and I put my flag down and we're not budging. You go bet a stump. He doesn't say that. He moves on. Patience with folks sometimes means that we have to move on. Patience sometimes means that we have to say, okay, I'll listen. I may not agree, but I'll listen. Patience may mean sometimes that we simply take a breath. The old adage, count to 10. It really does work. Learning to be patient with people is probably one of the most difficult things. And yet in Psalm 37, the psalmist there deals with the idea of people dealing with people. And the very first thing that it says is to wait patiently. To be an individual that is patient with the evildoers. To be patient with the folks that aren't doing what's right, to be patient with the folks that are irritating me, to be patient with the folks that have done something against me, to be patient with the folks that have said things about me that is not true, to be patient with the individual that said something that I said and twisted it and took it out of context and applied it to something else, to be patient with the individual that won't do what I do when I want it done, to be patient with the individual that says, hey, let's do it a different way, and you're thinking, this is the way it should be done. And preacher, you're asking me to take a breath? The answer is yes. Why? Well, first of all, because that's what God does with us. Second of all, what Jay read for us, love is patient. But also, in that wonderful Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reminds us in Matthew chapter 5 that whoever compels you to go with him a mile, go with him too. The idea of going the second mile with some folks is difficult. Going the second mile means sometimes I have to swallow what I want to say. I have to swallow my actions. I have to swallow what I think. I have to swallow what I want to get done. I have to swallow what is happening and move forward. Being patient means that I sometimes have to think before I respond, as we'll see in a few minutes. Stories told of an individual that came into work mad, just boiling mad. It seems as if their mother had said something to them that just rubbed them the wrong way. And so at break time, they sat down and their fellow workers saw them, and man, they were writing. That was in the day before computers. They were writing and they were writing and they were fuming. And they saw them at lunch and they were writing and writing. And then that afternoon, they saw them at break time and they were writing and writing. And then this individual came and gave this envelope to a coworker and said, "I've got to stay extra. I can't get to the post office. Will you mail this letter? It's to my mother. I'm mad at her." And the coworker said, "I'll take care of it." And he took the letter and he put it in his middle drawer and he closed the drawer without that individual knowing. And he went home for the day. Came back the next day, and here that individual came back and they said, "Man, I wished you hadn't mailed that letter. I was so mad at mother and I was wrong and I shouldn't have said those things in that letter. And I wish that I hadn't written all of that down and sent it to her. I wished I had just waited. I wished I had been a little patient." And the coworker said, "Just a minute," went into his cubicle, pulled out his middle drawer, got the letter, handed it to him, and said, "Here, you didn't mail it. I thought you needed at least 24 hours before I was going to send it off for you." Sometimes we need to wait. To wait. Be patient with others. But then second of all, folks that frustrate us, we need to also practice the golden rule. Well, once again, we're turning to the Sermon on the Mount, aren't we? In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. It's also found again in Luke's account in Luke chapter 6, that whatever you would that men should do to you, do you also to them. What a great thought. What a great thought that folks unfortunately have twisted and changed not only the very wording, but the very idea. Some believe and some hold to the idea that I'm going to get everything that's mine and I'm going to get everything that's not mine. And so they begin to grasp and they begin to hoard and they begin to pull in. I want more. For some, it's the idea of I'm going to get what you've got. And I'm going to take advantage of you. And if I take advantage of you, that's wonderful for me. And I don't care about you. But what Jesus teaches is this: put yourself in their shoes. That's what Jesus is teaching. Stop and think about the golden rule, as we call it. Think about what Jesus said. Whatever you want men to do to you. Now, just stop right there. It's not what they did to you. It's not return in kind what they have done to you, towards you. It is not the idea of saying, well, get even with folks or get ahead of them. It says what you want folks to do to you, you do to them. This is the law and the prophets. And so, if you want people to love you, you love them. If you want people to respect you, you respect them. If you want people to treat you kindly, you treat them kindly. If you want them to treat you nice, you treat them nice. If you want them to speak in nice, soft tones to you, you speak in nice, soft tones to them. You see, it gets back to that age-old adage that the Bible gives us, that whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Galatians 6. But it reminds us of the adage that this is how we're going to deal with frustrating people. Okay, I'm going to treat you, even though you're frustrating me to death, I'm going to treat you the way I want you to treat me. It comes out of one great principle. It comes out of the principle of love. John 13, verse 34, Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another." A new commandment. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Well, there's a great thought, isn't it? And then in John 15, Jesus says it again, love one another. Love. It's so simple. It seems so easy. But yet at the same time, too, it's so difficult to practice. But Peter reminds us that if we really do have that love for our brethren, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, he says that love covers a multitude of sins. That love looks over. That love smooths over. That love spreads over and covers. If you cover something up, what are you doing? You're hiding it, right? You don't want to see it. You ever do that? As a kid, I used to do that when I was eating. I was not a particularly picky eater, but I was finicky. Now, y'all are going to ask me what the difference is. I'll explain. There were times, things that I was asked to eat, that I didn't want to eat. And so you know what I did? I put it up under the lip of my plate. I've learned better. You can tell I've learned better. But at the same time, too, I thought I was getting away with it. I was hiding it. I was out of my sight, but it was not out of my parents' sight. And so Dad politely, plainly, and succinctly taught me the idea of whatever your mom puts in front of you, eat it, boy. Yes, sir. But you see, Peter says, love. It hides it, covers it. You don't see it, no one sees it. Why? Because you've replaced all the bad and ill feelings with love. And so the golden rule simply put is the rule in which we learn to give to others as we oblige them with kindness, loving them all the time and doing what we can to be at peace with them. Did you catch that? That spells the word gold. Give, oblige, love, and finally, do. But then, those people that frustrate us, there are also folks that we need to work at getting along with. You know, the Bible teaches that, doesn't it? God really expects that we're to live at peace with all men. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14 says this, live at peace with all men. In Romans chapter 14, verse 19, as much as is within you possibly, live peaceably with all men. We're told to get along. We're told not to be the folks of Thessalonica. In Thessalonica in Acts 17, it's interesting because they run Paul out of town and they follow him once he leaves. That's why in Acts 17, that beloved passage where it talks about these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, talking about the Bereans, is because Thessalonica didn't understand the idea of getting along with people. And so we need to learn the idea, the principle of what can I do to get along? Do I have to bite one another? Do I have to frustrate one another? Do I have to be an individual that responds in kind to what is said and what is done to me? The answer is no. Now, admittedly, and let's just call a spade, but let's be as honest as we possibly can be. And that is this. You hit my thumb, I'm going to react. You hurt my feelings, I'm going to react. You say something about my family, I'm going to react. You say something about me, I'm going to react. Just a fact of life. You know, the old psychology, took a lot of psychology classes myself. One of the old psychology adages is that there's a stimulus and there's a response. B.F. Skinner and some of those taught the idea of where there's a stimulus, there's a response. And in psychology, it's the idea, and Skinner worked a lot with dogs, and he learned that you could put a piece of food in front of a dog, and you ring a bell, and that dog is going to eat that food. And every time you ring that bell, that dog's going to eat that food. Until finally, guess what? You ring the bell, but you don't put any food there. Guess what the dog does? He salivates. Why? Because he has a response to the action that he's been trained. We do the same. We have a response to the action. But the Bible says, sometimes in our anger, it says, be angry, but don't sin. Don't sin. And so you ask, well, how do we do that? Well, I think the key is work at getting along with people. Be the individual that pursues the things which make for peace. That's what Paul would tell the church at Rome in Romans 14, verse 19. Pursue, go after the things that make for peace. Paul also wrote to the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 15. He says, don't render evil for evil to anyone. Pursue for the good, both for yourself and for others. Did you hear what he said? He says, don't respond in kind. Don't respond in a way that says, well, you did this to me, I've got to do that to you. No, Paul says, look for the good, find the good, work at getting along with one another. Respond with a loving way. Respond in a way that works with people. There was a man one time that every day he would walk past a lady's house on his way to work. And she was an old, cantankerous, mean-spirited, ugly woman. And every day as he walked past her house, both to work and from work, she would holler at him. And she would call him all kinds of names and talk about him. He'd never done anything to her. And he just didn't listen to her. He just kept walking. Finally, one day he went to work. She didn't say a word. She was on her porch like always. She didn't say a word. He came back. He went home that evening. She was on her porch. She didn't say anything. Neighbor said, why in the world didn't you say something to him? She said, he's as deaf as a post. He hadn't heard a word I said all these years because he's never responded. Maybe he was trying to get along. Maybe he was pursuing and looking for what was good. We need to work at getting along with people. It's not easy, but it's what God expects. But then we also need to think before we respond. You see, we talked about that response, and we talked about how we respond. But we need to think about that response. Oh, we've used that passage in James 1. We've worn it out, and I think rightfully so. Don't get me wrong. James 1, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. It's a good passage. Comes out of the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, where Solomon says, hey, watch your words. In the multitude of words, there's no lack for sin. That's what he said in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19. But the man that disciplines, the man that holds his words, the man that refrains from what he says, he has life. You see, here's the thought. Just because you thought it, just because you felt it, doesn't mean you have to respond that way. I used to, in congregation, not this congregation, but in the congregation I worked with, had a little old lady. And she was good. She was a good lady. But sometimes her mouth got into trouble. One day I was visiting with her. She finally looked at me. She said, Paul, she said, if I think it, I say it. Interestingly enough, this lady brought as many clouds as she brought sunshine into people's lives. Her name was Joy. Kind of a weird thing. Miss Joy, I said, shotgun's pretty much the same way. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, shotgun, you pull the trigger, you have this big explosion, boom, it's all over with then. She said, see, somebody's listening. He said, and so I said, yeah. She said, well, I don't get it. I said, well, you have that explosion, boom, But then if you shoot it at a wall, what does it do? It tears up the wall. Shoot it at a target, what do? You have a lot of pellets in the target. And you can't cover them over. Didn't change her, but she said, I made a point. So we need to be slow to anger. We need to be slow in our response. Let me think. Let me think about what I'm going to say. Let me think about how I'm going to respond. Why? Because invariably what we're then practicing is what? That golden rule. Invariably what we're practicing is that second mile. Invariably what we're practicing is the idea of waiting on people, loving others, doing what God expects of us. And in the end, let's think about something. In the end, aren't we to be changed into the very image of Christ? That's the thought I want you to hold. I will not be preaching next Sunday, but for the rest of July, of course, our brother missionary will be here in the last of July. We're going to talk about the eyes, the ears, the hands, the feet, Jesus. Why? Because we're supposed to be just like him, conformed into his very image, 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18. And as we are to be conformed into his image, we ask ourselves, as we're dealing with folks that frustrate us and feelings that all the time get next to us, what would Jesus do? How would he act? Paul and Barnabas got to a point in Acts 15 where the contention was so great. Now let's think about what had happened. Paul and Barnabas had gone on the first missionary journey. They had gone to Lystra and Derbe and to Iconium, Pamphylia, and to a lot of other places, and they had preached the word. It had been a short trip in comparison to, say, the third missionary journey. The third missionary journey was 3 years. It was just a few months, the first missionary journey, but it was successful. They had left from Antioch. They came back to Antioch. They had rehearsed the things that they had done, and man, the people were just astounded and glorified God. A little time elapsed. And Barnabas went up to Paul and he says, hey, Paul. And Paul says, yes, Brother Barnabas. And Barnabas said, brother, I think it's time for us to go on another trip. I think we need to go back and see the brethren. I think we need to go talk to them. I think we just need to go on another trip. And Paul says, man, that's great. Barnabas says, glad you feel that way. I want to take John Mark with us. And Paul says, oh, nope. We're not taking him with us. We took him on the first missionary journey, and part of the way through that journey, he decided he wanted to go home. Part of the way through that journey, he decided, home's better. There's a lot of things going on here. I'm tired. I'm weary. The scriptures really don't tell us why, but John Mark went home, and Paul was determined not, according to Acts 15, to take John Mark with him, but Barnabas was. Acts 15 says, and the contention became so great that they parted ways. Here's two godly men that we elevate correctly so as Bible heroes. Didn't get along. Now, as we read Paul's later writings, guess who is one that's mentioned that is profitable, Paul says to him? It's John Mark. Barnabas evidently and Paul make amends. And while they did good when they parted, because Barnabas took John Mark and he went one way, and Paul took others and he went another. And they were able to spread the gospel a whole lot better because they went separate directions. At the same time, too, wouldn't it have been wonderful in that story if they had not let their human reactions overcome them and they'd been able to figure out a compromise and work together? Yes, it would, man. And so, whatever the main aggravation between Paul and Barnabas was, they got it worked out. That tells us a couple of things. It tells us if you've got aggravation with people that have frustrated you, work it out. Get it solved. Get it resolved. Bury the hatchet. All those proverbial sayings that we use. Forgive and forget. Let it go. Let bygones be bygones. But at the same time, too, let us think about putting a stake down today and being what Jesus was and acting the way the Lord has told us to act. By being patient. By being an individual that basically goes the second mile. Treats the way we want to be treated by them. That slow in our response to them as we're getting along with them. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you need to be restored, won't you come? On together we stand and sing.